Are you looking for an internet talk radio station for your podcast? Look no further. At the helm of Passionate World Talk Radio are two women that want to provide a spot for you and your podcast to be heard. There are many other places for your podcast, but PWTR has the audience. You will not be disappointed. Our station has been on the internet for the past 16 years. Call us for more information. 484-364-1032 or text Jeannie White, station manager at PHECONNECTSHOW@gmail.com for podcast show details.
This episode of the Energy Stoners Cafe is sponsored by Passionate World Talk Radio and Lillian Caldwell. PassionateWorldTalkRadio.com.
Welcome to Passionate World Talk Radio. Educate, enlighten, entertain.
Welcome to the Energy Stoners Cafe. My name is Toni Quest, and I'm really happy that you're here. I like to interview the most interesting people I can find on the planet. So grab a cup of coffee, sit down, relax, and listen. You're going to find that these guests are so intriguing, you'll wonder why you didn't know about them before. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Energy Stoners Cafe. I'm always pleased to present the most interesting people I can find on the planet. Tonight, I have a very interesting guest, and his background intrigues me very, very much, being that I'm on the sort of like on the fringes, on the cusp of journalism myself, but we're not going to talk to him about that. I want to talk to him about what he does. His name is Dr. Gregory Mack, and he specializes in treating first responders and communities of color. He's in the Hudson Valley of New York State, and just so Dr. Mack knows that this particular show goes global. So I don't often tell people exactly where we are, but we're in the Hudson Valley of New York State, one of the most beautiful areas of the state and of the country. Dr. Mack is also someone that does his practice in the Hudson Valley as well, but yet he treats first responders. And what comes to mind with me first is New York City, 9/11, Black Lives Matters, all of the things we've been going through over the past, I'd say, decade or two. So Dr. Mack, thank you for agreeing to interview with me. I'm so happy that you're on the show.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
So tell me some more about what you do. I find the field of forensic psychology to be particularly interesting. I've kind of studied it in the sense that I've sort of followed people on the internet who are forensic psychologists in their blogs. I find it very intriguing. Why did you feel it was necessary to specialize in treating first responders who people know often suffer from a lot of different things like PTSD and other things? So tell us a little bit about how you got into this field.
Well, my introduction into the field is, I would say, pretty unique. It's rare, but I entered the field actually as starting out as a police officer. So I became a police officer for NYPD in 1987. And at the time, I was still attending John Jay College, getting my master's degree. And when I became a police officer, I continued in college. So I went through the St. John's University doctoral program and became a police psychologist. I was promoted to detective a month before 9/11. And so my specialty was evaluating police officers within the police department. So for the last 10 years of the 20 years that I was an officer, I worked in the role of a psychologist, evaluating officers that had a host of different problems, alcohol problems, depression, anxiety, and certainly after 9/11, influx of post-traumatic stress disorder. So the field always intrigued me. It's an exciting field. You meet so many different diverse individuals with all different types of backgrounds.
It sounds as if it's like a perpetual fascination, especially if you're interested in other people and you actually care.
Absolutely. One of the fascinating things is that I've discovered actually is that no matter what race you are, where you come from, there's often, for a lot of people, a history of some type of trauma. There's some type of trauma that they've experienced in their lifetime. So in evaluating police officers or even veterans, I worked for the VA for a number of years. I discovered that for those individuals seeking help, over 50% have suffered some type of traumatic event in their childhood.
In their childhood.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard a statistic from a psychologist that I am somewhat acquainted with, who works with the VA and works with veterans. And he told me once, he said that his statistics are that 75% of individuals on the planet are traumatized by something or have been traumatized by something. That frightens me a little bit for all of us.
Well, if you rule out car accidents, so many of us experience car accidents.
Oh, yeah.
There are a lot of ways we can be traumatized, whether it's in childhood or adulthood, on the job, off the job, whether it's through sexual harassment, experiencing a blackout. But also, when you look at the inner city, if you would imagine a young child waking up and there's a huge rat sitting on his chest, well, that's a trauma. I can't imagine any of us waking up and seeing a big rat staring at you, and you not be traumatized. So trauma comes in many different shapes and forms.
Right. It makes me think of my cousin who was traumatized by a spider when he was a child. He woke up and a spider was on him. And it's funny, it just, even though it happened when you were a child, the thing that's very, I guess, concerning is that these things carry on, and they carry on and they translate through your adult life.
Yes.
Even though it happened so long ago. What kind of experience was it for you dealing with first responders with 9/11, even though there have been other incidents since then, but that particular incident seems to have affected the collective. And my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and please do, my understanding is that it's worse for people, whether they were at 9/11 or not, but people in New York City metropolitan area have experienced more traumatic, I don't want to say trauma, but it's a bigger event for people that were in this area during the time, because it was just, we were right here. It was so close. Even if you were in the Hudson Valley and not downtown, you kind of feel that you're still in your neighborhood.
Right.
I remember, everybody remembers where they were, especially in New York. Do you see any differentiation between people from New York when they discuss or remember 9/11 as opposed to people that were not from New York City or the New York metropolitan area?
Well, being that my practice is based in New York, I predominantly am treating individuals who are from New York or have lived in New York for a number of years. So I don't really have any comparison data to see if people from other states are more impacted. But I think when you look at trauma across the board, people from other states can really identify from their own traumatic experiences with people from New York. So, for example, someone that suffered a building collapse in Pennsylvania, they would be re-traumatized by watching the towers collapse. So it's really hard to quantify more traumatized or less, depending on that person's history.
Yeah, and I think you have to be very sensitive to even be able to address something like this. Now, recently we've gone through what I view as a bit of a collective trauma with what happened, let's say, to George Floyd. If someone had watched that in real time, or seeing like the insurrection of the Capitol in real time. I think it has a different effect on someone that actually saw it, even if they were seeing it on TV in real time, than someone that was driving home from work and heard it on the radio.
Yes.
Or they saw like news bites on TV later.
Right. And the media, it's very interesting. My own personal observation with the media is that there seems to be some type of censorship with respect to who is being shown as the victim. So, for example, you might see the whole video on popular media. I'm talking about the television channels, not cable, but regular, Channel 7, Channel 5, showing the whole video of George Floyd being killed
over and over again.
Over and over again.
Ugh.
As if this is like a cable show, one. But from my recollection, I've never seen a Caucasian person victimized in that way, whether it's from being shot, from being hit with a nightstick or shot with a taser. So there appears to be a censorship where we are more receptive and used to seeing persons of color being treated in that manner than people of other races. Asian, Caucasian, I've never seen anyone treated in that way. So it's almost as if we're used to seeing a Black individual treated in that way. It's almost okay. The reaction, I think, would be very different if the person was white or Asian. But I can't recall seeing anyone other than Black individuals treated that way, whether they're being shot or manhandled by the police.
I can imagine that it's very stressful. I don't know what it's like to be a Black man. I know what it's like to be a Black woman. But I can imagine it's very stressful for a Black man even to walk out of the house every day.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the stress gets realized in many different ways, whether it's acting more aggressively than would be needed in a given situation. So there might be this extra bravado, which I guess would make one feel more comfortable in an environment that can be viewed as threatening.
Yes, a hostile environment. I think that might be a very effective defense mechanism for someone.
Absolutely.
How could you expect anything less of a person? That's just my opinion. I shouldn't talk about my opinion, but I'm just saying. Now, I want to ask you a question. Explain to the audience what forensic psychology is and how that differentiates from regular psychology.
To start with, regular psychology is really studying the mind, the brain, how we are affected by our genetics, how we're affected by our environment, and how we express emotions. Forensic psychology is a very broad but particular specialty area within psychology. Forensic psychology and it's really been popularized with the TV shows Criminal Minds and other shows. But forensic psychology is the study of psychology combined with the law as it's applied broadly. So when you consider the law, it could be criminal law, it could be civil, and taking a look at some psychological aspect of it.
That's interesting. I know that children are being taught forensics, let me say it right. Children, kids, students, young students in high school are being taught forensics in school. Now, what exactly are they learning? I wish I had that when I was in school because I just loved the whole subject.
I do as well. But forensics, so you can be a forensics engineer. And so what that would mean would be an engineer who is applying his trade through the legal profession. So, for example, you go into work one day, you sit on a chair, and the chair breaks, you fall and hit your head. Well, now you have a lawsuit, you go to court, and you say that my company provided, defective equipment. So I'm suing my company. But the company hires an investigator to take a look at the chair. And they can tell by the way the chair either broke or somehow was compromised whether or not it was an accident or maybe it was more intentional. So if I took a saw and cut through halfway through the legs of the chair and then came in and fell and claimed injury, you can actually get a forensic engineer to examine the chair to see that it was cut through. So it's less of an accident and maybe more of an intentional occurrence where someone was trying to file a lawsuit to get money. So forensics could apply to really any profession. You could be a forensic plumber, a plumber whose trade is to apply what they know to some legal aspect.
A forensic plumber. I want to meet that guy. That's interesting.
I'm sure he's getting paid, or she is getting paid, because it's a very specialized area.
That does sound very specialized. And so in regular psychology, I mean, that's regular psychology. If you do just practice psychotherapy, I can imagine the two things eclipse each other quite a bit.
Absolutely. So a psychologist can be an individual who just works conducting research. They don't ever have to see a patient. What's more widely known are the psychologists who provide treatment. So seeing individuals, couples, groups, children, criminals. Forensic psychologists work in prisons. They work in police departments. They work for the district attorney's office. They do research studying juries and jury selection.
What about people that are actually, you hear these stories. I know that there was someone I was following on Twitter just to see where this guy's coming from. Forensic psychologist in California, but he profiles people. If there's a crime, it seemed that he had the ability. I don't know if I'm just saying from my layperson's point of view, it seemed that he was able to tell who actually profile the person that actually committed a crime. I'm thinking in terms of, for instance, like the Boston Marathon bomber, and he kind of knew who he profiled, who it would be. And it turned out to be just those two people.
Right. So profiling, there's a scientific basis combined with a bit of art where you're looking at particular characteristics of behavior and individuals who are what's been observed in terms of the frequency of committing certain crimes. And it could be geographically based. So there are more crimes committed of a particular type in different areas compared to others. So there's a whole science behind the profiling. I guess in the media, it's more of an art and a special gift. Some of the profilers are using their sixth sense or their ability to connect with spirits. But less of that. There's also the scientific basis of studying the frequency of different types of crimes like strangulation and who's more likely to commit that type of offense than others.
So there's a personality type.
There's a personality type. There's it could be thought of to be a gender type as well, in terms of who poisons more often, men or women, who strangles more often, men or women. So again, you get the idea that body type might have an influence on the type of crime being committed. Who would use a knife more likely than not to use a knife than a gun. And so there are statistics that could be generated to, it's really being, it's really detective work. So in profiling, you see the combination of good old-fashioned detective work, whether you're profiling the scene of a crime, whether you're profiling the manner in which the crime was committed, crimes that are planned out, well planned, versus crimes that are, so to speak, crimes of passion that are not planned but just impulsively committed. So there's a whole science, and it's really fascinating area.
It is fascinating. I'm wondering also, given that we've been going through this, to me, sometimes it feels like collective trauma, with the pandemic and the fact that we've had to sort of, I don't know, everybody's different. That I've learned. They say we're all in this together, but every experience is very unique. I think that I sense that there's like a collective trauma that we're experiencing. I don't know if it's nationally, globally, regionally, but there's just a little something going on. I mean, I just kind of feel a vibe. I'm going to say it like that.
Absolutely. In terms of my therapy practice, I've gotten more calls since the pandemic started than I ever have in my 20 plus year career. Individuals are seeking treatment more now, I think, than ever before. So I would definitely agree. People have been affected, whether it's financially affected, certainly socially affected. We've been forced to sort of isolate, and just the constant news reports of the death rate, the death toll,
Yeah.
the sick rate, the illness rate. It's scary.
Yeah, there are a few things we can be traumatized with. What I noticed in particular is that when George Floyd was murdered, I couldn't help noticing it seemed that it was a collective trauma, and it superseded, it crossed racial barriers. It wasn't just black people. There were white people traumatized by it. I remember talking to one particular person who said, and also with the insurrection as well, this person said he was embarrassed. That's why he was embarrassed by it. He admitted that it was embarrassing for him as a Caucasian person to be of the same race as the person that committed the crime against George Floyd and against the people who committed the crime against the United States Capitol. He was very embarrassed by the people that were doing it. I don't know if that's a trauma for him, but I know it was a trauma for me to watch. I'm just wondering what you've encountered.
Absolutely. These events are traumatizing. They really set up the belief that the world is on the brink of self-destruction. But the reality is that we've been dealing with this problem and these problems for decades. There's nothing new about what happened to George Floyd historically, and we've seen it in our history books. Pictures of people lynched, set on fire, mutilated. And so this treatment of individuals, it's not new. It's not something that just started. It's been ongoing. And the fact that it gets broadcasted has added to the awareness of it and the historical nature of it. So on one hand, while it's traumatizing to watch, it's also enlightening for those of this generation who haven't seen a lot of that, who haven't been made aware. History is very funny. History is based on, it's really defined by who's telling it and whether it's being communicated accurately or inaccurately. And so this is, unfortunately, it's nothing new, but it's unusual to get it captured and broadcasted in all its glory, so to speak.
You can't deny, what you see. Although you can deny it. That's what we learned. You can deny what you see.
Well, the interesting thing is what you see is not necessarily everything that occurred. And so that's the other issue. And that's the other problem with the video is, although you see aspects of the video, and I'm not saying necessarily in the Floyd case, but what you see isn't always 100% of what occurred.
Right.
It's the perspective of the camera, and there's limits to that perspective.
Yeah, there are limits to it, indeed. Now, thinking about COVID and this pandemic that seems like it just doesn't want to go away, have you had to counsel people that have experienced grief counseling? Because everybody knows someone that they are close to or they've heard of someone. But I think I don't know many people that don't know somebody that who's fallen victim to the pandemic, to COVID-19. Have you been doing much grief counseling?
Well, that's an interesting question. The truth is that I haven't seen a lot of individuals for grief, for individuals who have lost someone, but the isolation caused by the lockdown has really left individuals to deal with their mental health. Usually, if we're working, then even though we might have symptoms that need treatment, we're caught up in work. So we're not really focused on those symptoms and we ignore it. But because of the lockdown and its effect on business, individuals have been, in a way, forced to address the problems that they've been having rather than working through them, so to speak, and ignoring them. So not a lot of grief, which is interesting, but people coming in that have already been dealing with mental health problems, and now there's sort of nowhere to turn, nowhere to run, and now they're being forced to really get treatment for it.
I found it particularly interesting what you just said a couple of minutes ago about, because I kind of know this to be true. When 9/11 happened, that was one thing. But let's say you had another trauma that happened to you, either just before that or before that. It seems like, why do the other catastrophes affect something that happened to you that had nothing to do with it, but happened to, let's say, might have happened to you 20 years prior, 10 years prior?
We call those triggers. They're events that occur that remind us of the traumatic events that we experienced. So when you look at an individual that has never had any traumatic event in their life, their response to a trauma is very different than an individual who has had a series of traumas. In a way, when we're developing, we know what to expect if we've been victimized.
Oh.
In other words, the trauma is just another event or another negative event that has happened in my life. And in a way, they're sort of used to it and not totally surprised that this bad thing happened to them. But for an individual who's never been a victim of any type of trauma, this new trauma that occurred for them, obviously it's life-shattering, and they're totally unprepared, totally unsuspecting that they would be affected in the way that they are. So the same event, two people experience the same trauma, and it can be very different from one person with a history of having traumatic events versus another person who has never suffered any trauma in their life.
Yeah, interesting. And explain to the audience what you mean about how an event can be a trigger.
So a trigger is basically a reminder. So if you consider our senses, we have 5 senses: the sense of sight, smell, taste, touch, and hearing. And each one of those senses has a memory. You can remember what a rose smells like. You can remember what a sunset looks like. So by that same approach, our senses remember what the sound of a gunshot sounds like. You can remember the sound of a collapsing building. You know what it means if you hear a scream. And so the memory of hearing someone scream, you come to learn that, okay, that scream means somebody is being hurt or victimized. And so, whether it's a year, 5 years after that victimization, if you're walking down the street and you hear someone scream, it's going to immediately, your body remembers. So you're going to immediately remember, okay, I hear a scream. I know what that means because I've heard that sound before. So your body is going to go into what it's called fight, or freeze mode.
Fight or freeze, not fight or flight.
Fight, flight, and freeze. So we have three options. It used to be fight or flight, but we've discovered that freezing is also one of the reactions to being startled or to a traumatic event. And so if we hear that scream, it's going to trigger a memory of either ourselves being victimized, or maybe you witnessed mom being the victim of domestic violence or dad being the victim of domestic violence. But each one of our senses can formulate the memory. The smell of smoke for a burn victim can be a trigger. They're going to remember that they smelled smoke when they were burned. So the sensory memory is just that. The individual remembers, and they remember the traumatic event, whether it's the pain or the danger, the threat that they faced when faced with that sensory memory, the smell of smoke.
It seems that we really all need more doctors like you on the planet right now, because I think that I agree. I believe a lot of people are traumatized and they might not express it. If your background was such that if you had emotions, you might have been taught to just stuff them down, pack them tight, keep it under wraps. Nobody wants to see how you feel, if you're like that, versus somebody that just like expresses every single thing that they feel. I'm wondering if there's anyone on the planet that has that luxury. That would be nice. I mean, to me, maybe I'm crazy. Who knows? But I think that what you do is so important, Dr. Mack. How can people get in touch with you? Are you taking any individual patients now if someone wanted to contact you?
So at the moment, I'm really cutting back on the number of patients because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the pandemic, the response was overwhelming. A lot of people reaching out for help. And so it varies from month to month. People can find me on the internet, just doing a web search. So I'm very findable. I'm all over the internet.
Dr. Gregory Mack.
Right. But it depends on the month whether there are any openings or not.
So probably the best thing to do would be to Google you. I know that you do have a website, or there is a site that has you profiled. I guess it's your own site. And can you just tell my audience that site? Because I've been there and I think there's a lot of information there that's useful.
Absolutely. It's www.drgimack.org. That's www.drgimack.org.
So there you have it, audience. And I thank you so much. You've been really generous with information. I appreciate that a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. Appreciate it.
And if something comes up within the collective that we need to consult you with, I would love to invite you to come back on and talk about it, because this was a very fascinating interview. Thank you so much, Dr. Mack.
Thank you.
And I want to thank the audience for always showing up for the show. I really appreciate it a lot. And next time I'll be back with another interesting guest. And for now, I say good night and bye-bye. Thank you for listening to the Energy Stoners Cafe.
Are you looking for an internet talk radio station for your podcast? Look no further. At the helm of Passionate World Talk Radio are two women that want to provide a spot for you and your podcast to be heard. There are many other places for your podcast, but PWTR has the audience. You will not be disappointed. Our station has been on the internet for the past 16 years. Call us for more information. 484-364-1032 or text Jeannie White, station manager at PHECONNECTSHOW@gmail.com for podcast show details. Thank you for listening to Passionate World Talk Radio. You can listen to this program all over again by going over to https://passionateworldtalkradio.com. You can also hear it on Spotify, Spreaker, Amazon Alexa, AMFM247.com every Tuesday evening between 8 and 9 p.m. YouTube, Facebook, Facebook Live, LinkedIn, and all the other podcast directories one can find on the internet.